There is a contrarian view, however. Some market players see this as an opportune time for any investors looking to snap up relatively cheap South African assets with the hope that we will have better business environment and policy certainty post the elections. Graeme Korner is a director at Korner Perspective, and he joined me earlier for that conversation. Mr. Korner, thank you for your time. Why would anyone invest in hope, and what's the premium for that?
Karabo, I think, quite frankly, investors always invest in hope. Frankly, when you make a 5-year investment decision, you have to effectively take a view on the future. Often visibility is not great, and in fact, a lot of people would argue the best opportunities come when visibility is at its poorest. So I don't think it's a question of hope necessarily, but rather one of sort of taking a calculated assessment of where South Africa is, where it's come from, and what we could do maybe over the next 5 years if we just pull a few of the right policy levers.
Graeme, I have to ask you something, because essentially South Africa finds itself in a position that it was at in the early 90s, if you will, just before Nelson Mandela went to Davos to try and woo investors. We are again sub-investment grade, barring one rating agency. Much of our economic strife is still pretty much the same. People are campaigning on jobs as they were in 1994. Goodwill surely knows the end of the tether, doesn't it?
I think you're absolutely right, and we mustn't sort of sugarcoat the realities. And I think the other sad reality is a lot of the pain we're going through today is actually self-inflicted. Quite frankly, the downgrades that we've suffered is because of a decade of maladministration, corruption, and in some cases the systematic dismantling of certain critical state-owned enterprises. What I'm saying, though, is South Africa over the last decade quite rarely actually managed to breach 2% GDP, but barring a couple of occasions, we actually still managed, in spite of all those hurdles we threw in front of ourselves, complete confusion around policy on critical issues, we still managed as a country to still deliver some economic growth. Sadly, woeful compared to what a lot of other emerging economies were delivering. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is exactly the same as your point, that we are probably back where we were a decade ago, possibly even 2 decades ago. But I think unlike many other emerging economies, we can get back on track quite quickly simply by making a couple of critical policy decisions and mobilizing capital. And I think that's the other key message that we would like to convey, is that I think there is a lot of capital in South Africa. We have a very well-developed financial system. In many ways, we exhibit sort of first world dynamics, and yet we are an emerging economy. So I think we could mobilize capital quite quickly. If we would just sort of stop shooting ourselves in the foot.
Shooting ourselves in the foot is something that South Africans have been akin to, shall we say, judging by the last decade. But Graeme, the goodwill that we are talking about here, how investors would look at South Africa as an investment destination, is really largely driven by the president, Cyril Ramaphosa. And the pollsters all expect the African National Congress to emerge victorious following the 8th of May elections. But the question is, it almost sounds as though the hope is as vulnerable, shall I say, to the president's position himself. I mean, he doesn't exactly have the strongest support within his ruling ANC and his national executive. And, this is really all up to him. So if we remove Cyril Ramaphosa from the equation, or the ANC does it for us, what do we have then?
Well, I think that is a very powerful question. And I think what we've got to assume that, at least for the foreseeable future, Cyril Ramaphosa will be the president of the country. But I think your point is very, very powerful. We need to build around that. We've already, and I think it's one of the things that we take some comfort from, we've seen progress, even though institutions like Eskom have been systematically almost destroyed. We've seen, the Public Enterprises Ministry and the Finance Ministry, for example, and even, the Mining Ministry being able to come up with a mining charter that has been very elusive and often offended investors. So I agree with you. I think we need to build a system that is more than just the president, but ultimately, I think it's up to President Ramaphosa to galvanize the country, to give it policy certainty, to put good people in place. But we can't rely only on one person, and I do agree with that point.
Graeme, there's been a lot bandied about South Africa's need to reform some of the policies that make it very difficult for money to make it onto our shores. But that has been a longer conversation than it needed to be. So what hope do you have that Ramaphosa, if he gets, let's say, a favorable majority coming out of the elections, what hope do you have that we will actually see reform and at pace?
So I think the first thing that I would say is that, coming back to the point I made earlier, for a decade we really were lost in the wilderness, and in spite of that, South Africa was able to progress. If you look at a lot of listed companies in a very difficult economic environment, were still able to grow their footprint. Many of them expanded into the African continent, which I think is another reason that a lot of foreigners like the South African story. But if I could put it slightly differently, if you just think over the last few years, Anheuser-Busch came and bought SAB Miller. Now, only 20% of SAB was South Africa, but the African footprint was a very attractive play for them. You had Acton, for example, coming in and buying Murray's. You got Glencore starting a new mine. Not so long ago, you had an Israeli investor looking to buy into Clover. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is we as South Africans get sort of a little bit despairing of our own political reality, but capital is agnostic and it will follow where it believes it can get returns. And I think the point is that those examples that I gave, and there are many others. If you just look, for example, at the chairman of Vedanta having built up a massive position in Anglo-American, and I understand that Anglo-American is sort of sub 50% SA, but there are people out there who believe in the future of South Africa. So I think our view is that we tend to sort of get a little wrapped up in the negativity and forget the fact that we actually have a very strong, very well established financial system and deep capital markets. We are still, in terms of the African continent, a very strong player, and I think we can help mobilize growth in not only SADC but in much of sub-Saharan Africa. So, and having said that, I think when you're buying into South African companies, because I suppose that's what this discussion is ultimately about, is should you be certified if you put money into South African equities, or is it the inspirational decision? And the point that we would make is, if you look at companies like City Lodge, who obviously has suffered at the hands of a very difficult business confidence and economic environment, have gone out and they're building hotels in Kenya and in Mozambique and Botswana, and they've significantly invested in that capacity. And if a little bit goes right in South Africa, business like that will do very, very well. And there are lots of examples like that, companies that had used the South African base and built up great footprints in the rest of the world, and particularly in Africa. And I think that is still very, very appealing. And I'm thinking about companies like Standard Bank and ABSA and ShopRite, just as a few examples. So I think we tend to get a little bit despairing as South Africans, and we get wrapped up in the negativity, and we forget that business continues. The sun will rise tomorrow, and people will go into ShopRite stores, and people will take out cell phone contracts, and I think that, to me, is the key. So I think our view is that the markets actually hate, it's a corny saying, but the markets hate uncertainty more than bad news. If we get bad news, we get policies, we can deal with it, and we can move forward. And that is, I think, what's been holding South Africa back more than anything else over the last few years.
He hates uncertainty. He can handle bad news. Director at Korner Perspective, Graeme Korner, thank you for your time.